not exposed to anyone.
Yeah, get like a fan.
FYI, we're starting to record right now, so don't say anything I would if you were now on the internet.
Right, recording is on, just FYI, so.
We'll give a couple minutes before we really officially start, because there's like 20 people outside the door right now grabbing their lunch.
Please, come on.
Thank you.
More than 20, actually. Guys, if you want to, if you want to go.
Oh, go for it. Yeah, no, this is my first time coming here, so. Did you drive or?
Yeah.
JB?
You know, parking.
So one of my.
What's worse?
So I figure it's only an hour, so we're probably fine.
If it works.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, it'll just be that. Thing apparently happens like every 3 months. It's like this secret magic club, basically.
Okay, we'll see.
Get their friends together, do a thing.
That sounds really good.
Like, it's really that aesthetic, and somebody's like just in the garage, and they've got all this stuff. You can read an article at some point, magic garage, and it's like, they won't tell you where it is, you had to get there by invite only.
Is there a password?
You can't say, who do you know here? And you say, I'm here with John. He goes like, which John are you talking about?
Yeah, I have them in my bag.
The one who knows magic.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I'm
that was the, you guys watching
I
Resident
rushed
Evil?
it.
What was the name of that? Oh, right, you say Resident Evil. Yeah, what was the name of the place where Joe was? It's like the Gothic,
Cause she's,
castle crap.
you guys are on the same.
Well, LA is the magic castle.
Yeah, she wrote.
Actually,
And I was like, kind of her picture, I kind of like I couldn't go.
Yeah.
But you also have magicians perform multiple times at the magic castle. And I coaxed him to come here and talk about magic and science interplay, and I'm pretty sure he's gonna do a show at the same time. So,
No, I had no idea.
here, in the
I
show.
found it like.
I'm sure he's better than me. I do it as the hobby, right? People have paid the money to format.
You do?
No, I just meant like it's not that, it's not nervous. It's like closer. Like don't go to.
It's just like all my energy was put into like.
Yeah.
Hopefully they know that next week.
Yeah, right.
All right, I'm gonna start doing at the overview level stuff, probably the next 1 minute. Because it'll probably take me about 15 minutes to get cranked through it. But I want to have plenty of time for really, this is for you all to kind of drive this stuff. Dr. Stern, y'all got a drink, napkin?
How did dentist appointment scheduled for that day? I was able to change.
Dr. Hong, Dr. Lee, Miss
Especially I was
DiGiammarino,
like, oh, I can just skip class. And I was
and
like,
Dr. Basaviah.
I'll show up.
And just FYI, everybody online is actually watching, listening to this already.
Like get a seat in the front.
Just determining that, I guess.
So, yeah, you're like, way too Luckily, this class counts for.
One of the panels, you guys,
So she's very nice.
How many
It's like 24 or something. Yes, and staff, and then there's like the BMI. So it's too much. Yesterday was like really good. I mean, I'm a third year and I'm still nice. I'm also kind of like, I don't know.
Join the panel.
They're like, oh, we want to go like.
Second of arts, what is your opinion?
Yes.
I'm gonna go ahead and get started because we have a whole panel here of very distinguished speakers. We want to get their input, and I'm sure it'll be a whole dynamic forum as we go along. I'm going to create the broad overview to get us started. If you're one of the 2 people who does not already know what ChatGPT is, there are 100 million people ahead of you. You need to go online, just create an account and play around with it and see the dynamics, and it will surprise you what it seems to be capable of with these interactive capabilities. Whether it is a good idea or not, Pandora's box is open. It is out there, and people are using this for all reasons imaginable and unimaginable. This is a story from last quarter, let alone this quarter. A substantial fraction of Stanford students are using this tool right now, and they are just turning in assignments without editing them based on what ChatGPT offers them for their classes. A brief break, a little bit, what is this thing? How does it work? I'm not going to do a very in-depth overview, but just a very high-level intuitive thing. You know, when you type your search into a Google search, I'm looking for medical AI something. As you're typing, autocomplete comes up. It says, hey, are you looking for medical AI boot camps, startup companies? How does it do that? How does it guess what you want to say? What does it you possibly need? Under the hood, they've looked at thousands, millions of times people have searched for similar terms, and it's essentially memorizing these parameters. Well, 13% of the time people pick boot camp, 10% they pick startups. Each one of those numbers is some parameter it's memorizing about how different words are associated with each other. But what not just search terms, what happens when you pour every textbook that's ever been scanned before into a language model? Every article on Wikipedia, the New York Times, every Twitter and Reddit conversation, what happens when you pour all of that in and you start memorizing not millions? What happens when you start over time exponentially growing, right? I was studying some of this stuff. It wasn't that impressive a few years ago when you got millions of parameters. Now we are up to billions, tens of billions, 170 billion plus parameters is what's powering the public ChatGPT, and you have not even seen yet what's behind the scenes, what's going to be next year as these continue to grow. But whatever, it's just bigger. That doesn't mean better. Strange thing about these systems is they're demonstrating emergent properties. All they are doing is, in some sense, I'm simplifying, they're autocomplete. Guess the next word in the sentence. When you do that at a broad enough scale, it turns out you do not try to, but they can answer questions, they can translate documents, they can generate ideas, these unusual emergent properties, although perhaps not that surprising, because what is the medium of our creative and emotional thought, but through the language, the medium of language. It's just surprising that it can do a lot of this stuff without necessarily deliberate effort. Just blast through a couple high-level examples. You should just play with it, do this yourself. You can generate content. Hey, I need to get an insurance authorization for my patient to get this drug approved. Drafts a letter with a reference, surprisingly, and this reference is actually reasonably accurate. Medical student wants a letter of rec. Tell them they were on my service for a week and add an endearing anecdote about how some family appreciated their care. Drafts a letter. Not the best one, but a decent starting point. Very good at summarization. Here, draft a patient basic summary, discharge summary. The patient was here for heart failure overload. I treated them with IV Lasix and got them good meds. Reasonable draft right out of the box. And you know what? Extract out the medication list and assign an ICD-10 code and put it in tabular format so I can easily extract that. And translate that into patient instructions readable at a 5th grade reading level in Spanish. It is amazingly good at these language manipulation tasks, realizing the distinction between manipulating language as opposed to other aspects. But it doesn't always just have to be human language. How about computer language? Write me a piece of Python code that can convert an RX norm ID to Snowbed. Boom, there's your Python code. And you know what? I don't know how to do it. Can you convert this to R, C++, Julia? Write a unit test function that will verify the function. All things out of the box. No one's trying to make it do this stuff. It just memorized everything on GitHub, and it does this as well. However, I did this several times. This code is not correct. It does not actually execute properly. It has a couple logic or semantic errors that are correctable, but the fact that it even knew where to start to look was impressive. Because one of the key limitations of these systems is profoundly prone to confabulation. Some people call it hallucination. I actually like confabulation. I think it's a much more accurate term if you think in terms of medical terminology. Because hallucination implies it believes this thing. This thing believes nothing. It has no understanding. It's just an object. It's just stringing together words in a way that seems to make sense. Who is Jonathan Chen? Oh, Stanford Biomedical Informatics? Pretty reasonable. I never went to University of Pennsylvania. I'm not a cardiologist. It is just making stuff up. But if you didn't know better, completely credible and believable, how would you know the difference? Provide references to explain how opioids can be used to improve mortality and heart failure, and provide me references. It says, I'm not totally sure about that, but okay, here are some references. Go search for these PubMed IDs. Go nowhere. These articles are all made up. It's just stringing together words so it looks coherent. That is what it is incredibly good at. These are not analogism. It's just strange, that interaction. So beware. Caveats. With that in mind, think about where it's progressed over time. I had students working on projects answer basically board exam questions using technology like this a few years ago, but it was getting like 34% accuracy on a multiple choice test. I'm like, that's kind of cool, but like it's completely unusable. So I kind of stopped paying attention. The scale of these systems has grown and grown and grown, and now we're here, we're getting to substantial jumps. These systems are basically at the passing level for medical licensing exam questions, and then a lot more that our panel is going to talk about. Which begs the question, it has to be asked, so fine, here we ask, who is smarter, the computers or the humans? When it can, out of the box, answer medical licensing questions, board law exams, business exams, all at the same time without any specific intent, you can imagine the reaction from many educators. Oh my God, this technology must be banned. After all, when you give a doctor a medical degree, you do it because based on what they know about medicine, not in terms of how well they can use a bot. What's your thoughts about that? I'm very interested to hear our thoughts from our distinguished panel today. I'll introduce them each in turn with a one prompt question, and after we do one cycle, we'll open up more broadly to jump in anywhere. There's far more to talk about than we can possibly cover in an hour. This will probably be first of a series of things that will follow up and through the spring quarter. So I'd like to first start with Dr. Preetha Basaviah, Professor of Clinical Medicine, Assistant Dean of Pre-Clerkship Education. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself, your role in medicine and education, and what are your thoughts? What is your I think you have this instinct too, like, whoa, what is going on with this technology? We need to like block students from using it. What are your take on how to approach that and where things are going?
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. I'm Preetha Basaviah. I've been an educator and internal medicine doc for about 25 years, starting initially in hospitalist world on the East Coast. And I'm assistant dean for pre-clerkship education for the past decade. I've been involved with clinical skills courses nationally for about 2 decades, and at Harvard, UCSF, and Stanford. I've learned a ton from my colleagues. I am not the tech savvy person. That's my husband, who's a VC. I am the tech impaired and challenged. So it's really an honor to be part of this panel, and thank you. I would say as an educator, there's about 3 themes very quickly. Opportunity. I sometimes call it gap-opportunity, but opportunity, skills enhancement, because everything in education can be seen as a theme of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And then lastly, innovation. These are the 3 things that come to mind, which I would say would ask us as educators to embrace, collaborate, and partner with this technology, not to ban it. And so I want to give one example. When first year, second year medical students are completely stressed out about preparing for their national licensing boards, there was this whole trend for them to use supplementary resources like first aid for the boards and other things. And when we as educators maybe look aside and say, we're teaching to our curriculum and you do that in parallel, there's a real revolution and resistance, just like we may be seeing now with this revolution. And the issue there is, can we meet the learner halfway, midway, and understand what are the positive attributes that can help enhance and amplify what we're doing? And when we quickly change to actually saying it right in class and putting it in our syllabi, if you're going to use first aid or Kaplan, here are the kind of things they do well, here are the kind of things we're not going to cover, because we're training you for a future of providing healthcare, not for a test that you're going to take tomorrow or next week. It's lifelong learning. And so then I think people really were able to embrace both on the faculty side and the student side and partner when we provided more practice with questions in the test. So similarly, when ChatGPT has come out with an incredible explosion, you might think that many educators' first thought is we need to say you can't use this, honor code, don't use this. But that's not realistic, nor is it really showing that we understand things that are going on for the current generation. And so there's an opportunity. This leads then to the skills. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. And that's how you get to be a physician with clinical skills. They talk about in Blink like over 10,000 repetition of a particular skill. And we can't do that with the people and resources we have now. So one potential use would be to use AI to help us do these practice, maybe with simulation for cardiac heart sounds, for clinical reasoning, whose leaders are here, generating cases that maybe faculty may take hours and hours to put pen to paper because it's kind of stunning and a little bit paralyzing. But if you have some type of a draft that you can adapt and correct, wouldn't that be helpful in creating skills and enhancing them? And similarly, this could be seen as a tool itself. So one of the course directors in PTD, to your opioid pharmacotherapeutics, in your opioid analogy, put in the question, are cannabinoids and marijuana safe? And then the generated responses were then kind of corrected by the students and incorporating the science of the mechanisms behind it. And so it became really an engaging exercise rather than a straight memorization of a lot of facts, which might be gone tomorrow. So how to use resources and tools. So lastly, innovation. When we saw this poster, David Gaba, the Dean of Simulation, reached out and he said, I'm really interested in providing an accelerated path for AI and simulation. Perhaps it will take us hours and weeks to recruit an entire team to teach a group of students, but wouldn't it be great to use VR and AI to have the student and perhaps one supervisor, and then generating the nurse, the physical therapist, the family member on the team, and provide, again, simulated training that is incredibly valuable. So these kinds of innovations are going to be incredibly critical. And I look to see from our experts what other things they would talk about. So the last thing I would say is that with great power comes great responsibility, which sounds like one of those superhero kind of things, and it is. And so we are, as educators, need to come up with practice policies like journals have for authorship. No ChatGPT allowed as authorship, for example. We need to be able to maintain the integrity of exams. So no more open book for us, in person, lockdown browser for the assessments that are high stakes. But for maybe practice quizzes and assessments, there could be some use of AI and explicitly stating to what extent you could use those, just like we say group work for some and individual work for others. So then I would ask for the experts in the field, can we come up with software and other apps that can help us screen those responses to see if it comes from an AI generated platform? Because as we know, educators are probably not going to be the most able to say, was this generated by a bot or was this generated by a highly sophisticated student? And lastly, the confabulation is concerning. Having done a study analysis with the experts here, let them tell you about the study. It's likened to if you ever had an essay exam and you had to, somebody plants a joke. They say, I wonder if Dr. Basaviah is reading this essay because I have a headache. And the next three things are here in the differential. So you are going to have to be very clear and making sure that the statistics and facts included there are accurate. And so this gets at the insights and nuanced skills that we expect in the next generation, the ability to use tools and not to just supplant what we all already know. An ultrasound is another example. Eric is an expert in using ultrasound and physical exam. I hope that it can amplify and enhance our skills, but not necessarily replace our skills.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Basaviah. A lot of teasing there to foster further discussion, but I want to keep moving along so we get an overview. Dr. Strong, if you don't know him, I think Dr. Strong is one of the best medical educators I've ever worked with. He teaches so effectively, so well. You can see the evidence of that. He created the Strong Medicine YouTube series with over 500 million subscribers. I'm pretty sure that's read a lot more than any paper I've ever published.
500,000.
500,000, sorry.
500 million would be impressive.
Okay, it's all big numbers. I'm losing sense of scale here. I was up at 2 a.m. prepping this, but anyhow. Many things you could talk about. You happen to have led a particular recent effort. This USMLE exam, that's cool, but like multiple choice, kind of whatevs. That is not what a doctor does. That is not clinical reasoning. What's your take on what's possible? And you did a study on this. Maybe describe just a little bit about it and anything that surprised you in terms of how that emerged and what you expect.
Sure. So thank you, Jonathan. So the study that we had done, actually, a lot of people on this panel were part of the study. We took the clinical reasoning exams that we give our first and second year medical students to ChatGPT. And the clinical reasoning exam at our school, what it consists of is you can imagine a 1,000-word patient case, all written out in prose, given to the students in increments. So we give them, for example, the medical history, and then we ask them some questions, some open-ended, free-response questions about how they interpret that data. Then we give them the physical exam, and we say, all right, now based on this, how does your understanding of this case change? Can you summarize this case? Can you come up with a list of likely diagnoses that you'd be worried about? What diagnostic tests would you choose next and why? And it's a much more difficult, higher level skill than answering multiple choice questions on a USMLE test or the medical licensing test. And so we actually didn't know what to expect when we gave ChatGPT, gave ChatGPT this exam. And it actually did much better than I think I would have guessed. And the way what we did, we actually, we have this very standardized predetermined rubric that we use for our students. And we applied that exact same grading rubric to the ChatGPT's responses. And it passed almost about half the time of the cases. So that the first thing that surprised me is just the fact of how well it did. I think what also surprised me was what it did well and what it did not so well. So if you had asked me when I was a kid, like, what is AI going to be doing for us, for the average person in 2023, I would have predicted it's going to be doing like solving complex mathematical equations and like doing all kinds of high level analytics. But like things like writing poetry was like well beyond what AI could ever possibly do within my lifetime. And what I think we've seen with ChatGPT is the complete opposite, right? It does amazing with language specific skills. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. And analytical skills, not so much. And so in looking at ChatGPT, when one of the questions that we would ask it would be, and this is a pretty extreme example, but a really typical question we would ask as part of our clinical reasoning exams is to take this 1,000-word case and reduce it to a 200-word summary. And the description was very specific in the prompt. It was basically saying like, summarize this case using no more than 200 words or in 200 words or less. And then we would grade its response against our rubric, and it would get some points for mentioning very important relevant details. It would lose points if it mentioned things that are completely irrelevant, and it would lose points if it exceeded the 200-word limit. And it did amazingly well. It produced summaries of these cases that are, I'll be honest, better than our students. Yet it lost points consistently on the 200-word limit, which just sounds so bizarre to me. I would not have guessed. Another thing that sort of surprised me about ChatGPT, which is already talked about, was its confabulation. So not only does it confabulate things like journal references, but it'll confabulate case details. So you give it the case, you say, what do you think is the diagnosis, and justify it. And it'll give you a reasonable diagnosis for the case, a reasonable explanation, but the justification is made up. They will say like, I think this patient has meningitis. I'm like, okay, that's a reasonable hypothesis for this case. I think this patient has meningitis because they have fever and they have a stiff neck. And the case actually says the patient does not have a fever, does not have a stiff neck. And it's dangerous because if you only read the answer, you only read the prompt, it sounds very reasonable. Like it's very well constructed prose. And it's it sounds very medically savvy, but it's completely wrong. And so when otherwise when ChatGPT, like I said, it passes almost half the time. When it doesn't pass, it gets it really wrong. And you have to be an expert to discern which is which.
I would say sometimes it's also more dangerous that the best lies are hidden amongst elegantly within the truth, because it gets really hard to tell. You're more scared of the student who just makes some stuff up than the one who tells you I don't know, right? We'll get to questions in a bit because I want to make sure we get to everybody. Mr. DiGiammarino, from an educator, but also from a patient perspective, what do you think this has implications for?
Yes. Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm the Practice of Medicine Education Manager for year 2. And I think as we're teaching this, it's really important to think about how patients might be using this as well. And I did spend 4 years cycling through various specialties before being diagnosed with a chronic condition by a genetic cardiologist. And it was difficult, even with medical training, to create a coherent narrative with symptoms that started when I was 8 and grew increasingly worse through my 20s. I could have used ChatGPT to create a narrative in a style that highlighted and organized the information specifically for the specialty I was seeing. And that could potentially help providers see the big picture and the details, and might help patients like me who felt that they weren't really being heard. And then the other sort of side of it is that now we have personal health records. So patients can see any doctor's note or imaging report, but these are using medical jargon, right? And for some people, they're completely unintelligible. So it's conceivable that a patient could literally copy and paste their own medical reports into a chat bot and ask it, what does this mean and what do I do with it? So I think there's pluses and minuses to both of those use cases. And my hope would be that, even in our curriculum and our training, doctors will continue to take time to, 1, listen to the patient, and 2, explain info in an accessible way and tailored to that patient, because I don't think ChatGPT is up to that yet. But yeah, so those are just some ways I think patients might start using this.
Just to expand upon that a little bit more, a paternalistic approach could be, it's like, whoa, ChatGPT wrong 30% of the time, patient, you better not do that. We have to be the arbiters of truth and control of what you hear, what you don't hear, because it's so important. How would you appraise that from a patient perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of already happening, right? Because sure, I've brought in things from UpToDate or WebMD and actually had doctors say, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I don't want to look at that. And that did turn out to be my diagnosis. So I think that's a dangerous model as well. I think that patients are still going to be using it. I think they have access to it right now. They're probably already using it with all these 1 million, how many millions of
100
people?
million.
100 million people.
Plus.
A lot of those people are patients, all of them. So I think we need to learn how to work with the patient on that rather than completely push it away.
Great, the thing we'll follow up for. I want to keep on going to Jason Hom, Dr. Jason Hom. Go ahead and introduce yourself, all your key roles, really brought to you because you're an excellent doctor, but also you know a lot about medical documentation and the implications of it, which would be the very natural application for some of these kinds of tools. Tell us more, why does documentation matter? Who cares? I'm trying to take care of the patient here. What are the implications of it? And where do you think this might shape the future?
Yeah, and thanks so much, Dr. Chen. So it's a very interesting situation that we have. Obviously, clinical documentation is very important for a variety of reasons. It's important because that's oftentimes how healthcare practitioners communicate with each other, like a primary care provider reading a consultant's note, or someone on an inpatient service who's about to rotate off, because even doctors get some time off occasionally, reading the notes that their colleagues wrote about that patient as part of a sign-up process. It's a way we communicate with patients now, as Alicia alluded to, with the open note system, a lot of patients will actually look at the notes. And it's also a record for an individual provider when they're seeing a patient 6 months from now and they have 2,500 patients on the panel to kind of refresh their memory of what the prior discussions were. So clearly, a lot of implications for clinical care and good patient outcomes. And separate from that, there's obviously a lot of reasons why clinical documentation is important for risk adjustment models, for billing purposes. For better or for worse, we live in a very metricized society. I think very few of you would probably go to restaurants if it had really poor ratings on Yelp or on Google. Individual providers, hospital systems, they're all ranked. And a lot of how they're ranked is based in part on risk adjustment models that extract a lot of information from ICD-10 coding, which is based on documentation. The documentation is really important. But if you look at the literature, part of that is that a lot of providers actually, if you do time motion studies, actually spend more time on a given day in the EHR, working on charts, either reviewing charts or writing notes, than they actually spend face-to-face with their patients. Which, when you think about it from a patient care perspective or patient satisfaction perspective, is quite a striking finding. So I think, as Dr. Strong alluded to with how well it did, for example, in distilling the pertinent positives and negatives from a 1,000-word case into an assessment, I think there's definitely a lot of potential, obviously at a very early stage, for having what we term computer-assisted documentation. In the best case scenario, this would be a win-win situation because it would also free up doctors and other healthcare providers to spend more time, for example, with their patients at the bedside who are doing more of the analytical work that's maybe higher yield in certain cases. So I think it's an interesting field. There's also obviously a lot of really complex medical legal implications to this as well too. But I think that we can. I think, as you heard, Dr. Basaviah has been an experienced educator and leader for well over 2 decades, and actually was one of my preceptors when I was a resident in Sim Clinic, and incredibly compassionate at the bedside, taught me much of what I know. Can I say that the medical students that are the first and second year students that Dr. Basaviah alluded to, like when they become residents, are they going to be in a radically different situation in terms of documentation or use of, chatbots like ChatGPT? I think almost certainly. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I think there's a lot of really fundamental questions that still remain unanswered.
Fantastic. We'll round it out with Dr. Ron Lee. Go ahead and introduce your role, yourself in many different roles, and then you can talk a little bit about, I mean, you've been involved with directly and certainly seen many attempts in machine learning, AI, and medicine. Most of its hype is going nowhere. Is this any different, or why does this feel any different to things you have seen before?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So hello, everyone. I'm Ron, and I'm a hospitalist, like other members of this panel. And I have a couple of roles in digital health. Primarily, I work in the health system, and I think a lot about how do you create new models of care delivery, business models. And this is certainly very interesting as an enabler of care models that probably previously weren't possible before because of availability of resources and operational costs. I think this is actually a really exciting time, not just the kind of immediate effects of having this chatbot type capability, but just assuming that this is now available cheaply. How can we just reinvent how we access care? So anyway, that's kind of one side of it. But to your question, John, yeah, I mean, I think this is a little different from what has been going on with at least machine learning, at least in healthcare. I think one difference is that there is something fundamentally different about language as the medium by which users interact with machine learning. So for most, if not all of you in this group, I mean, you're all familiar with typical classification models, prediction models. I mean, they could be super accurate, but there's just something that's very unrelatable to the end user, and definitely to an end user like in healthcare. And unless the model is just perfectly accurate, it's just really hard to really see how that, you don't interact with it in the same way. Whereas with ChatGPT, you can see it could actually not make sense at all. It could be completely wrong, could hallucinate, but it'll still have an impact on the end user. In fact, it could have a very dramatic impact. It may not be a positive one, but there will be an impact in a way that's fundamentally different than if you just presented the user with a number or with some even like binary category. So I think that's very different. I think the other difference is that we've now, in many ways, I would say democratized the availability of machine learning capabilities beyond the kind of core pockets of experts, technical experts to the wild now. I mean, you see kind of even in the short period of time, you have whole companies that are now created that are AI companies that previously it never would have been possible because they have access to this capability that, I'm sure these large companies can make available via APIs. And then all of a sudden the work is actually no longer the development and optimization of machine learning, but it's just given that you have this thing, like what are all these brand new capabilities and models that you can just now create that not just a group of machine learning engineers think of, but the world is thinking about. So I think that'll have some exponential effects. And then finally, just reflecting on this theme of medical education and speaking as myself, I'm a physician, I was a medical student not that long ago, and now I help, train medical students. I do think that, I was actually talking to my friend recently about, we were talking about ChatGPT and AI and just the future, but just like, we all both have young kids. We're just thinking like, does it really matter if someone gets an 800 on their SAT verbal at this point? Like, that's kind of a commodity, right? Like what skills are even important? And it all just came back to this sense of emotional intelligence. I mean, like, we were just getting to this deep philosophical discussion about like, what is it, like assuming that generative AI will be a lot better, which it might, assuming that it'll even be much better than it is now, like what is just fundamentally human that we will never lose? And it sounds a little cheesy, I guess, but I think this concept of like being connected to the world, being connected to the people around us, like what does it mean to know something? Like we know that a large language model could appear to know something, knowing as in having all these based on statistical associations between words, it'll create something as if and it probably does know it in that sense. But I think it's very different from a human being knowing something. Like I know that chest pain could be associated with a heart attack. Yes, I've read it, and yes, my brain has made that association in terms of those two words, but I've seen patients with heart attacks. I've talked to them. I've had conversations. I see a person grabbing their chest with pain. I've had to convince their family members they're okay. Like that's all part of me knowing that chest pain is associated with heart attack. So how do you think about that unique aspect of human intelligence and pair it with what I think is a real type of intelligence that will inevitably get better and more accessible? And how do we become almost, I like to think of something like thought partners in that sense, and redefine essentially what it means to be an expert, not just a medical expert, but probably this applies to other areas of expertise as well.
Fantastic. Well, now that we've met all of our panel, I see questions coming in online as well. I have some other general ones, but I want to open up to the audience. Scotty, I saw your hand up earlier. You want to go ahead and jump in now? And then anyone else, if you think of something, draw up your hand. Otherwise, I'll go to the ones online.
Yeah, it was some specific questions about the study that was done. I'm curious if you just use like vanilla prompting or if there was any in context learning where you provided an example of, say, a prompt and response as part of the input to the model.
So that's a great question. We started with just the same exact language that was used for the students. And if we sort of just judge that the answer just doesn't follow the question, which happens sometimes. Like, for example, there's certain terms that we would use in medicine, like, for example, we use the term a problem list. And if for those of you not medically inclined, that word may mean something very, very different to you than it does to people who practice clinical medicine. And ChatGPT just did not understand what that term was even asking for. So we had to like reword the prompt to explain the term, like provide a problem list, which we are defining as such and such. But we didn't necessarily give examples beyond that. We didn't train the bot in any way, other than just through trial and error, try to find the best prompt for the case.
Yeah, and I guess a sort of a follow-up question for the panel is like, we've seen in context learning can potentially mitigate some of these issues of, say, not following the question or not following the prompt. But it can also potentially reduce some of the confabulation, hallucination effects. I imagine we could do even better if we had fine tuning, but currently there's sort of a barrier, particularly with ChatGPT as one instance, right, for being able to actually adapt the parameters of the model to specific use cases. I'm wondering if that capability was there, do we think that a lot of these potential problems we're highlighting would basically go away?
For what it's worth, I mean, we describe it as, this probabilistic word autocomplete. That actually is most of what it is. There's layers on top of it. There's supervised learning to fine tune it towards more coherent answers. And there's reinforcement learning, don't do things that a human would make them mad. And so there clearly is an opportunity to do that. And we're doing like the meta layer on top as users. So clearly opportunities beyond that, but that would be a great research direction for a lot of young students and postdocs to pursue, I think. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think so when you're referring to in-context learning, I mean, that is one of the interesting phenomena that I don't think was quite necessarily predicted, right, with large language models. In the sense that, yeah, you have these statistical associations, but you actually are seeing kind of concepts that are emerging as just somewhat consistently through these models. So yeah, maybe. I mean, we don't know, right? But I think that's one of the reasons why many of us do believe that this will get better. Because I'm not enough of a machine learning expert to tell you if this will get better, but just in terms of the dynamics of the world, I mean, people are incentivized to make this better. I don't think the creators of GPT-3 even expected this to work that well. I think it was actually a bit of a surprise how well this worked and how much in context learning there even was. And I think what's going to happen is you'll have more compute power available to more people. You'll have probably more data. And if you think about this was just trained on general data sets. What happens when, like UpToDate or Elsevier starts to make their data sets available and train their own models? We don't know, but probably you're going to see some concepts actually being consistently understood by the model. And maybe in effect will be less hallucination. But it's interesting. And then what I'm personally interested in is in not just how the model performs, but think of the AI and the human user as like one unit. So what is that human AI unit what is the impact on the human AI unit if, for example, you had more robust in context learning, which is going to be the cumulative effect of the AI, but also like the expert responding in some way and what the expert does. Like I think of that as like one unit, and then think of how that unit behaves and what that has on whatever workflow or system that they're in. I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting research around that.
Fantastic. I'm going to get a couple of questions online, but I see this one coming up from Ashish online. Maybe Dr. Basaviah, have you address it first. Patients are using ChatGPT, whether it's good or not. Maybe we should make a Dr. GPT. It's not just trained on the internet. It's like trained on UpToDate and medical textbooks or something. And maybe would we feel a little bit better than that rather than just what's out there in general? And if you have an intuition of this, and anybody else would like to comment.
I feel like there's a whole generation of Dr. ... on TV, on different media, and they have credentials. So I think the Dr. ChatGPT, what would be the credentials? It would be a gajillion layers of data and potentially quotes from other people. but could it actually analyze what's most likely in this individual without scaring the heebie-jeebies out of them and saying, oh, most likely you have pneumonia because you have a fever, productive cough, and something on your chest x-ray, and be able to explain it clearly? Or would it say something like, well, the most worrisome thing is cancer, but you're a 25-year-old, a human being would have said, but this is not likely. But the first word would come out would be, you might have cancer, because that might be what was the most searched term for blood in your productive cough and some history of smoking. So my fear would be that people would use it if someone created it, and without, again, practice or policy guidelines about what is reasonable, since references are actually not accurate and are made up. That doctor would be giving confabulation statements possibly, and patients might be trained to believe it and have really emotional, I think you said, I heard you say traumatic, but I think you said dramatic, but both dramatic and traumatic things could happen from people hearing things like that. So I wonder if there's an interface where there's like someone hidden that's going through the responses and sifting it, because there's got to be some liability for whoever creates that too. What would happen to the person as well. But again, we have to embrace it. So if someone looks up something on the web and they say, I looked this up, can you look at it? Much to what Alicia was saying, at least there's a conversation started, not the end all be all.
Yeah, if I can address this issue also of like the idea of training a chatbot on medical literature rather than the general knowledge. I think one of the challenges that, and this seems like a very, very solvable challenge, but one that we shouldn't forget about, is that in the medical literature, rare diagnoses are overrepresented compared to how common they happen in real life. Like, so for example, you could compare hantavirus, right, a virus spread by bats in Arizona, which may have, I'm making this up, may have 10 cases in the United States per year, against influenza, right? Influenza is 10,000, 100,000 times more common than hantavirus, but probably has only 10 times as much literature about it as hantavirus does, because we understand influenza really well. And it's an important disease for us from a public health standpoint, but from a basic science standpoint, it's kind of boring, right? Compared to hantavirus, it's like cool and sexy and new. And I think anytime we train the chatbot, we just have to keep in mind that like, some of these rare diagnoses are to get overrepresented, and sort of to Dr. Basaviah's point, I can easily imagine like a patient using this and getting it pushed all kinds of rare, what we call zebra diagnoses that are not applicable at all, but just because it sort of fits what's sort of the sexy topic that's being talked about in literature during the years that the bot was trained on.
You could see it going the other way as well too, right? Where it misses the diagnosis altogether. That was a little bit rare. Maybe it was a zebra. The chatbot didn't get it.
But I mean, especially if it's a diagnosis that hasn't been described yet.
Right.
Right. That's something else the chatbot won't be able to do, is it will assume that it's a disease that exists, not that it's a disease that hasn't been described yet. Versus I feel like, a skilled clinician would say like this patient's having a collection of symptoms and findings. It doesn't fit anything. I have to research more. It's not going to force a diagnosis on the patient the way a chatbot might be inclined to do.
Maybe Alicia can expand a little more from patient perspective. What would it take you to like trust these kind of symptoms? Like, is it get more accurate? It almost certainly will, but it's never gonna be 100%. It only makes up stuff 5% of the time. And also it's available 24 hours a day. My doctor, I can't get an appointment for 3 months. So whatever, let's just do what it says.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. So for me, it would take a lot, right? Like, I don't trust this thing at all. But for a lot of people, having trained COVID-19 contact tracers and case investigators, there's a lot of misinformation out there right there that people just take up. So I could see people, really putting a lot of faith in it actually. But I do want to just reiterate that I think the question is, why did that person look that up? And why are they bringing this to you? Because the patient is the expert in their own body, right? They're the ones that are living in it every day. So I think that there's so much information in whatever it is they come up with.
It would be interesting to think back to when Google first came out. I mean, Google, it's a relatively new technology, and it did, I would say, change the landscape of the availability of information for patients in a very dramatic way. Before that, actually, I would say the only way to get any medical information would be to go to some center or go to your doctor. Whereas with Google, you can actually, ChatGPT is actually no smarter than a good Google search in the sense that it has access to almost the same amount of information. It's just a bit more efficient. So it's not like a patient with ChatGPT will have access to somehow like more. So I guess what I'm trying to say is patients have had access to this for a while now. And it would be interesting to look at how has that changed care models. And I would say it actually hasn't changed it as much as you may think. I mean, ultimately patients are Googling stuff and whatever, and I'm actually a very huge supporter of that, but it's not like that has replaced medical interactions just because there's a lot that has to go into receiving care. And yeah, I would just, it'd be interesting to look at like what changed when Google was first popularized. How do you take lessons from that and apply that and adapt it to now with ChatGPT? And the other question is the chatbot even the actual product we're talking about here? It was just kind of like an accident that OpenAI released a chatbot just for convenience sake. It's not necessarily because the chatbot is the optimal product to solve whatever problem it was to solve. Let's just create one so we can make it available. But the underlying technology is not the chatbot. The underlying technology is the large language model, which can actually do a lot of things. So like, what are other products that may not necessarily be chatbots, or even it could be a chatbot, but there are other features and user interfaces you could build on top of. I would imagine all of that will be very salient, over the next couple of years.
Great. I'll direct the next online question to Dr. Hom, and then I'll come to this one, and then I'll round back. It really relates to things you were talking about before. She's online with a lot of hospitalists. There's so much stress. I got a data entry into the EMR all day. Wouldn't it be great if it could like summarize long patient histories, give us quality time back with the patients? Wouldn't that be a more positive way to think about how AI ChatGPT will impact our practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think ideally that's the goal. I think I alluded to before to like medical legal concerns, and we're actually already starting to explore some of those. So as an attending, like as the attendings here now, and we work at a teaching hospital, say a medical student writes a note, or a intern writes a note, or a resident writes a note, or a fellow writes a note, then we eventually basically put in kind of a boilerplate attestation that says, I agree with everything above with the addition of, or accept this, or I've made modifications, which is basically saying, I agree with what's said, and if there's something that I didn't agree with, I either took it out or I modified it. So it may be the case in the future that the exact same process applies to what AI generates. So the same way that an attending says, I agree with what my resident wrote here, they review what ChatGPT or some similar technology wrote, edit it as necessary and say, now I agree with this, and then it becomes part of the medical legal record. So that's, I think, where directions are likely headed. Obviously, the onus remains on the attending to sign off on the information and the data, regardless of whether it's human generated or AI generated. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I think there are some nuances to be thinking about, for example, like there are, to try to save time, I mentioned how much time documentation takes for providers. So a lot of institutions, Stanford included, in certain clinical contexts, will actually utilize scribes. So people oftentimes with an interest in pursuing a health professions degree that will serve as a scribe for a doctor. There's other forms of technologies that try to automate that process. I mean, a lot of you probably have smart devices at home that can listen. It's not that hard to link that to some sort of electronic transcription service. It's conceivable that you can think of some system that will do something similar for history of present illness, other aspects of the documentation. I think that one interesting thing that's not studied, because this is also new, and it kind of links back to a point that Dr. Basaviah made, where I think she made it in terms of conveying information. That's where the human touch, Dr. Lee made the point about emotional intelligence. The human touch matters when you're conveying information to a patient. Even if the chatbot gets the diagnosis exactly right, allaying patient concerns, just the bedside manner in which we do it, that matters. But the same actually is true more upstream too, in terms of collecting information that gets input into the systems. Like one example would be, on a fairly routine basis, we all have to ask fairly sensitive questions to our patients. It could be about sexual history. It could be about alcohol use. It could be about use of illicit drugs. And we're taught a lot of ways in which to try to do that in the most appropriate way as possible, using normalizing statements, obviously developing rapport with patients first. So some component of generating information upon which documentation is based does, I think, depend on the human touch. I guess you could play you could be a devil's advocate and say, maybe actually in the future, patients will like to walk up to some sort of robotic system
Non-judgmental.
and actually say, oh, maybe I'm more likely to give all this information to the robot about, sensitive information. So no one's really studied that, but, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions. Like, I know a lot of you are involved in research, just like a gazillion research questions that we can try to address.
There actually are some studies that patients will suddenly be more willing to give sensitive information to a computer system than a human being.
Yeah, so Dr. Chen raises an outstanding point, which is why sometimes there's surveys as opposed to, people are, so there's, that's a good point.
Maybe also just throw in one disclaimer on a comment that doctors, please don't copy and paste patient information to ChatGPT to summarize. We're uploading protected health information to a third company server. And I know many of you are doing that right now. You need to stop doing that. This question here.
Yeah, hi. You more or less asked the question already, so feel free to discard it if that's not interesting. So it's a question for any of you to answer. Which requirements, let's say which kind of guarantee rather would you require so that you would be willing to deploy ChatGPT in the pipeline somewhere at the hospital? So I'm not saying 100% confidence on the answer of ChatGPT on a medical question, but enough so that you would be willing to deploy it somewhere at the practice or the hospital.
That's a great general question anyway. How confident you have to be in your laboratory tests, in your CT scan, your ChatGPT, how confident you have to be for you to use it to affect patient care? But this is relevant for all of them.
More than we are.
I think it depends on for what. I mean, what do you mean by deploying it?
Yeah, somewhere in the hospital to do something, summarization, generating reports, to analyzing images, well, to analyze images, but I don't know.
Well, sounded like some of the literature showed about QI interventions, quality interventions, where if really busy hospitalists might have like 20 or 30 patients on a service, and you might be able to trust algorithms that say patients A, B, and C are actually your most acutely ill and maybe require this level of service and this kind of place to be. And maybe that would be something that people would be willing to use. But I really wonder about making clinical decisions, and then we would be responsible for it ultimately as the attending of record. And I, for one, wouldn't be comfortable with that, as just like Jonathan said, I wouldn't be comfortable with my student copying and pasting. So we tell them, here's a blank piece of paper, generate your note. Don't use a template, don't download from prior notes, because you have to learn the skill. Back to that practice. If you don't actually lay the foundations and the muscle memory of that. So I guess the question would be for maybe seasoned clinicians, if they would be willing to do that and then sift through the data. Maybe it would be on a simpler note, but like the actual clinical decision-making part, I think, where would we be if we handed that off to someone and really, like you said, the wrong information? We have human error, but I'm not sure I'm willing to take responsibility for AI error.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mentioned this, I talked about the study, a lot of this worked on earlier, and the bot got borderline passing grades about half the time for a first and second year medical student exam. Like, if that's the bar you're shooting for your medical care is a borderline passing first year medical student, then like ChatGPT is for you. But if you're hoping for something, with higher accuracy, higher reliability, it is not there yet.
I would say, I would also just even reframe the question. When you say deploy ChatGPT into healthcare, I think that, like, I would actually reframe it as, would we be willing, or how would we be willing to use large language models to create products and services that solve some problem in healthcare? Like, I would reframe it that way, because in that sense, you can imagine there are actually many ways to do that, and the thresholds will just depend on which product or which service you're creating. Like, for example, we've had something called robotic process automation, RPA, for years, and it's literally just a bot that fills in forms for you. And there are companies created around that, and it's valuable. And I'm pretty sure that's not even close to the capabilities that a large language model has now. So it just depends. Like, I would not ask the question, how do we deploy ChatGPT? Because again, ChatGPT is not a product. It's a demo that a company created to maximize the number of people who would be able to test this capability. It's not a product. So what kind of product or service do you want to create? And then how is it going to add value to whatever system, company you're selling it to?
I did read an article from a doctor in a practice that was very confident using it to do things that were kind of clinical and adjacent that required language, right? So generating prior auth requests for insurance. This guy was all about that. I have not tested it myself and don't necessarily recommend it, but something that's an actual product like that, I think would be the first place.
Many different ways we can go. Just because there's more questions that we're clearly not going to get to all of them, so I want to squeeze a couple of them. Sherry had one, we'll go to John.
Yeah, maybe like to this topic, I was also talking about, use of this in, in education and class assignments and so on. And so my 8th grader actually had to write an essay in middle school about should we allow or ban ChatGPT, right? That was the topic. And they clearly said like, there's no point in banning it, right? That was like the immediate answer, right? So I'm wondering, is that a valid way of thinking about it? It just becomes like a new baseline, right? So the teacher has access to it, the student has access to it, they're all aware of that. And then now it's like we need to improve upon that, right? So this is like, and because this is new, we're kind of desperately trying to find analogies like somewhere, and they all don't quite fit. But I'm wondering if like a pocket calculator is also something that, when it was introduced, it was like scary, and then we are still teaching arithmetics to students, but then we're also integrating it into a curriculum. So I'm just wondering if that's like a valid analogy, or if that helps in any way to make sense of this.
I agree. I'm sorry, I have to go to clinic and teach, but I would agree. I gave that example of using like first aid for the boards, for the exams, and first being a little fearful and then embracing it. What about cliff notes for all of those books? Well, you're really depriving yourself if you go through life not reading the book and reading the cliff notes. But if it gets you through maybe your book club or your journal club, maybe that would be something that people might think is not harmful. But if you go through school and don't ever actually understand the texts, what kind of scholars and people and generational learners are we creating? So I think putting it out there and creating policy and practice, like if you use this, it will be against this honor code, but use this for that purpose, maybe like in the formative part of getting some ideas on paper, but you first have to fact check or look back. And same thing with calculators. You can create problems that involve concepts and understanding and how you would describe the answer to someone and show your work kind of thing that would not be replicable with a calculator, but maybe might be something that ChatGPT actually, as I'm saying, it might generate. But I think being very clear that we know this is out there, this is how we will be able to use it, and we have tools to figure out if you've used it. And that would be really not part of our teacher learner agreement. So we'll see.
In medical education, there's like this framework called RHYME, right? I mean, there are 4 letters and it's an acronym. It represents kind of like the 4 different levels of mastery. I mean, you guys can probably do a better job explaining to me, but there's like the reporter, which is like your first level. You just have to report information back in a concise way, interpret the information. Then you actually have to manage the patient and eventually educate. I mean, in many ways, I feel like I agree, like this thing will not be, even if you try to ban it, it's there. I think it'll actually elevate the value of really learning and teaching and learning first principles in a way that I think we actually kind of need to do anyway in medical education. Like I'll often, for example, I'll be on service and I'll ask my medical student, hey, this patient has abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, fever, like what's your differential? And you can just tell that they're just like reverting back to the script they memorized from some class and like, oh yeah, and they'll like list all these diagnoses in no particular order sometimes. And they're doing basically actually a rudimentary version of what a large language model is doing. They're associating words with other words, and that's how they know something. And then it's my job to tell them, you don't actually know what you're talking, not in a mean way, but you know like what you're saying versus like, do you actually have a sense of, this is how your abdomen, like anatomically, this word is, and like actually understanding it. So I feel like in that case, but right now we still value it because there's no alternative. Like doctors are the ones to do that association. But assuming that's going to be a commodity, like what does it really mean to know something? How do we actually teach that part? Which is ultimately, I think, what we need to be doing anyway.
I like the example that you gave because this discussion was a lot on conceptualizing our philosophy and our ethical imperative, our moral imperative, as a profession. A lot of what we do is professional identity formation. You don't want to have you say anyone who graduates from medical school in whichever rank you are graduates with an MD, but you don't want to have the MD who missed a particular day of surgery training. They make that joke, well, I ChatGPT that, and then that's the day that, you're participating in the appendicite, the appendectomy. You want to make sure that you build skills that with confidence and with consistency, and that can be replicatable. And I don't really know if we don't have boundaries and parameters and a moral imperative to understand what's out there. I feel like Cliff Notes and everything, when it first came out, was like such a big deal, and the same with all these other resources. And right now, it feels like a revolution and transformational. But I'm hoping that with a lot of people talking about it openly, with your 8th grader writing an essay, saying, I gotta really think about this, because am I gonna actually be able to do anything in college and in my job if I rely on other resources? And I'm glad that they had a chance to think about it in a safe environment with you and your teachers.
As we're kind of right on time, but today's discussion, I got a clinic, and actually the 4 of us have to go to a meeting in 60 seconds. So, Josh, we should last question. There are 10 more questions lined. We will not get to them. Obviously, this is an important topic. They will follow up at a subsequent time.
Well, first, thank you. This was very interesting. But my question is for Dr. Strong. For the you mentioned you use an exam to test the ChatGPT. How much reasoning would be involved for a human to solve the question in the exam versus summarizing or memorizing text? And did ChatGPT do a good job when reasoning versus summarizing and memorizing text?
So it does, so I mean, you can code questions based on the skills that the question is asking. Like, is it a matter of summarizing text? Is it a matter of regurgitating signs and symptoms of a specific disease? Or is it more analytical, like what diagnosis does this patient have? That it does the worst on. So it still does better than I would have guessed, right? The analytical skills, like trying to identify the actual disease the patient has. But that's definitely the worst skill compared to things that are purely language-based, like purely summarizing the case. Or things that are just recalling things that it was trained on, like tell me the signs and symptoms of heart failure. Like it knocks that kind of question out of the park.
When you said perform worse, I assume you mean like way worse than like a human expert, right?
It performs worse than the typical first-year Stanford medical student.
That's our bar. Fantastic discussion. There's a lot more. We're never gonna get to it. Let's thank our panelists and we'll follow up. Online, we'll do something again because there was a lot more discussion to cover that we couldn't get to.